Hi friend, tonight we're going to step quietly inside a medieval castle and see what life was really like behind its thick stone walls. Not the romantic version with warm feasts and shining torches, but the quieter truth that most people living here felt every single day. A castle protected you, but it also shaped your life in ways you could never fully escape. Before long, you'll notice how the walls hold on to cold, how every corner has its own small discomfort waiting for you. The first thing you feel is the chill. It's not the gentle morning cold from open fields, but a slow, tired cold that rises out of the stones themselves. These walls have lived through hundreds of winters, storing the chill like a deep memory. Even in summer, you might catch a draft curling around your ankles, or slipping up your sleeves as you walk through the passages. The castle never truly warms. It breathes cold air the way a sleeping animal breathes in the dark. And before long, you hear them. Faint, quick scratches moving beneath the rushes on the floor. A soft clicking of claws against stone. Rats were as much a part of castle life as the people. They liked the warmth of the hearth and the smell of stored grain just as much as humans did. You might see a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye, a small shadow slipping between barrels in the storeroom or disappearing behind a wooden chest. Terriers were kept specifically for hunting them, but the rats knew the walls and passageways far better than any dog. At night, when the castle quieted, you could hear them most clearly. A quick scurry, a soft thump, sometimes the sound of something small brushing against a bit of old straw. For the people who lived here, this was normal. No one liked it, but no one expected anything different. The great hall might look grand at first, but the air inside is thick with smoke. Fires burn all day and most of the night, yet they barely warm the room. Heat rises too quickly, slipping past rafters that have grown dark from decades of soot. Down on the benches where people sit, warm air thins out into cold pockets. One side of your body might feel almost comfortable while the other remains stiff with chill. And everywhere the smell of smoke clings to wool clothing, to wooden tables, even to the tapestries that soften the walls. Once that smell settles into something, it never lets go. The rushes on the floor help cushion your steps, but they hide 1,000 little secrets. Bits of dried food, crumbs from yesterday's meal, stray bones, dirt from boots, and the constant fine dust that settles from stone walls as they shift over time. Servants occasionally scrape up the old layers and scatter fresh ones. But the moment people walk across them again, the mix of smells begins to build. If someone lifts the rushes too quickly, a sour, heavy scent rises into the air, the kind that makes you turn your head slightly without meaning to. Footsteps echoing up staircases that twist in tight circles, a child calling out and being gently hushed, a guard's boots creaking as he shifts his weight while standing watch, someone pounding bread dough against a wooden board. All of it blends together into a layered hum, the kind you stop noticing after a while, though it never truly disappears. Clean water takes effort. Servants carry it from the well or from a stream beyond the walls, climbing narrow stairs while trying not to spill what little they have. Proper washing is rare, and usually done with cold water in a room that never quite warms. People make do with what they have: a cloth, a basin, a bit of scented herb to mask the smell of smoke or sweat. You can imagine the relief of cold water on your hands, followed by the uncomfortable sting of cold air against damp skin. Sanitation is never simple. Waste drops through garderobe shafts built into the outer walls, falling into pits below. On a humid day or after a heavy rain, the smell drifts upward again, carried by the same drafts that slip through cracks in the stone. Servants scatter herbs or pour small amounts of water to keep the odour down, but the structure of the castle itself works against them. Even nobles deal with the same air. No one escapes it entirely. And always there are the drafts. Thin, sneaking currents of cold that slide beneath doorways or slip through the edges of shutters. People know which benches are warmest where the sunlight falls during part of the day, and which spots to avoid during the winter months. Tapestries sway gently when the wind turns outside, and the movement of fabric on the walls becomes another soft, familiar sight. Despite all this, people live inside these walls for years. They eat, work, rest, and raise children here. They laugh in the great hall, gather near the hearth for warmth, and walk the same stone steps so often that their feet memorize every rise and turn. The castle may be uncomfortable, but it offers safety in a world that is often unpredictable and harsh. Thick walls may let in cold air and hidden rats, but they also keep out thieves, storms, and dangers from beyond the countryside. If you sat quietly in the hall at night, after the fire had burned low and most of the household slept, you would feel all of this settling around you. The darkness would be deep but not frightening. A faint glow from the last embers would make the room feel timeless. Somewhere far off you'd hear a rat skitter along the rushes, or a guard's boots tapping along the stone walk above the gate. And in that moment, you'd understand how a castle could feel uncomfortable yet strangely safe. A place shaped by stone, by cold, by small sounds in the night, and by the quiet endurance of the people who called it home. In the 13th century, the great stone castles rising across Europe were far more than the homes they appeared to be from within. Each fortress stood at the centre of a network of land, power, loyalty and danger, and the thick walls that shaped daily life also shaped the politics of the region. Every castle had an origin story, a point in time when its first stones were laid, usually under the authority of a noble family powerful enough or ambitious enough to carve its presence into the landscape. Most 13th century castles were built during periods of heightened uncertainty. Borders shifted frequently, rival lords competed for influence, and kings relied on loyal vassals to maintain stability. A castle's owner was rarely just a landholder. He was a military commander, a judge, a host to travellers of status, and a figure whose loyalty could determine the fate of the surrounding countryside. Some castles belonged to ancient families whose lines stretched back generations. Others were newly granted by a king rewarding service or demanding tighter control over a contested region. A charter or royal writ often recorded the moment ownership began, locking the lord's rights and responsibilities into writing. Visitors who came to these fortresses often arrived with purpose. Not every traveller was welcome, but the ones who were, envoys, tax collectors, wandering priests, noble allies, entered a world where hospitality acted as a political language. In a 13th century context, hosting was not just kindness, it was proof of legitimacy. A well-fed guest who left satisfied spread stories of the lord's competence, generosity, or strategic importance. A slighted guest did the opposite. These impressions moved faster than letters and shaped reputations across vast distances. Inside the great halls of many castles, seasonal gatherings brought together neighbouring lords, clergy, merchants of importance, and occasionally even members of the royal household. Feast-marked marriages, treaties, festivals and victories. Food filled long trestle tables, musicians played lutes or rebecks in the corners, and banners from allied families hung on the walls in quiet declaration of shared purpose. These events were long, structured affairs, where the seating order itself communicated political hierarchy. A noble seated nearer to the lord enjoyed favour. One placed farther away took the message in silence. But these celebrations often existed alongside underlying tensions. Castles, by their nature, were built for defence, and the rhythm of hospitality was always touched by the possibility of conflict. Gates were never left unguarded. Courtyards bustled even during festivities. Scouts kept watch from the battlements, their silhouettes standing against torchlight as the evening deepened. A feast could be interrupted by a distant messenger. A peaceful year could turn abruptly with a single rumour. Within those stone walls, joy and caution lived in constant balance. The landscape surrounding the castle mattered deeply. Many were built along rivers, which provided trade routes, water supply and natural barriers. Others stood on ridges or hills, their height granting visibility and advantage. Some guarded mountain passes or critical roadways. The most formidable were surrounded by moats, broad, water-filled trenches that discouraged siege towers and slowed advancing armies. Contrary to popular imagination, moats were not always stocked with water. In some regions they were simply deep dry ditches lined with sharpened stakes, nearly as effective against attackers. The castle's gatehouse was its most vulnerable point and therefore its most engineered. Drawbridges spanned the moat, rising by chains when danger approached. Portcullises, heavy iron grills, could drop in seconds, sealing the entryway with brutal efficiency. Murder holes in the ceiling allowed defenders to rain boiling water or stones onto intruders trapped beneath. Arrow slits in the walls gave archers narrow yet deadly vantage points. Every feature of the gatehouse existed to delay, weaken, or intimidate an enemy before they reached the inner court. Some castles never saw battle, yet their designs still shaped the lives within them. The outer bailey, often a broad yard surrounded by a palisade or secondary wall, held workshops, stables and barracks. The inner bailey, closer to the keep, housed storerooms, chapels and quarters for members of the household. Above all rose the keep, a final stronghold designed to survive even when the outer defences fell. Its thick walls, narrow rooms and elevated position made it both a refuge and a symbol of authority. In times of crisis, villagers from surrounding lands might seek protection behind the castle's walls, swelling its population and turning every open space into a shelter. The political significance of a castle extended far beyond its stonework. Kings relied on their lords to maintain these strongholds not just as homes, but as administrative centres. Taxes were collected here, disputes were settled, and proclamations were announced. Documents sealed with wax travelled outward like threads of the castle's influence, binding the region together through law and obligation. A castle could stabilise a territory just by existing. Its presence deterred bandits, discouraged rival nobles, and signalled the reach of authority to anyone who passed near. During festivals or religious observances, the castle took on another character entirely. The chapel became the heart of gathering, with candlelight reflecting off simple painted walls. Clergy recited prayers, choirs sang hymns, and the quiet of the sacred space settled into the stones. Some ceremonies honoured saints, others marked marriages or alliances. The arrival of a visiting noble or high-ranking church official transformed the castle into a stage of formality. Guards lining the courtyard, banners unfurled, trumpets signalling the guest's arrival. Such visits reinforced alliances and reminded the household of its place in a wider feudal world. Even when no guests arrived, the castle's purpose extended outward. Patrols left from its gates to oversee the surrounding lands. Messengers rode in and out with tidings from nearby towns or distant courts. Farmers brought tribute from their fields, acknowledging the Lord's protection. craftsmen arrived with goods to trade or repair. A 13th century castle existed in a constant exchange with the countryside around it, elevated not only by its walls, but by the relationships woven through every path leading to its gates. When evening approached, the castle's defensive instincts sharpened. Guards took their posts along the battlements, scanning the darkening horizon. The drawbridge, if raised at all, creaked upward with a groan of wood and chain. The heavy door behind the gatehouse was barred from within. Torches flickered along the parapets, their flames bending in the cold wind. From the tallest tower, a watchman peered out across the land, his silhouette barely moving as he stood in patient vigilance. Within those thick walls, life continued with a deeper quiet. Fires glowed steadily, conversations softened, yet the castle itself, its stones, its gates, its towers, remained alert, shaped by centuries of conflict and caution. It stood as a symbol of its lord's authority, a guardian of the people living in its shadow, and a reminder of a world where security depended on strength, vigilance, and the endurance of walls built to survive far longer than those who walked within them. Many ideas about medieval castles come from stories, paintings, and modern films, rather than the world of the 13th century itself. When people imagine a castle, they often picture grand stone staircases, endless torch-lit halls, and nobles sweeping through richly decorated chambers. But the truths behind these fortresses were far more practical, shaped by military necessity, limited resources, and the realities of medieval life. The stones that still stand today tell a quieter story, one of strategy, compromise, and daily endurance rather than glory. One of the most persistent myths is that castles were vast, luxurious residences filled with ornate furnishings and constant grandeur. In truth, most medieval castles were austere places. The great hall, the symbolic heart of the household, served many functions at once: dining room, courtroom, administrative centre, gathering space, and even sleeping quarters for lower-ranking members of the household. Its decorations were simple compared to modern expectations: tapestries to reduce drafts, a few carved chairs of significance, and long wooden tables that could be disassembled quickly. Thick stone walls retained cold more readily than warmth, and comfort was a luxury earned through layers of wool rather than elaborate ornament. Another common misconception is that every hallway was lined with burning torches, creating bright, dramatic lighting. Movies often show castles bathed in fiery glow, but real 13th century interiors were dim by necessity. Torches smoked heavily, consumed valuable resources, and posed constant fire hazards. Instead, small oil lamps, hearth fires, and narrow windows provided most of the light. Much of the castle was in shadow, and people learned to navigate by memory as much as sight. Darkness was part of medieval life, not something to be conquered with endless flames. Even the weapons and armour associated with castles are often misunderstood. Films frequently depict knights in full, shining plate armour striding through corridors, or negotiating treaties while encased in steel. But plate armour did not exist in the 13th century. Warriors of this era relied on chainmail, interlocking iron rings woven into tunics and coifs. It was flexible, effective, and painstakingly crafted, but also heavy, requiring conditioning and endurance. The image of a knight collapsing under the weight of armour is another myth. Trained fighters moved with surprising agility. What limited them most was not weight but heat and exhaustion during prolonged combat. Castle defences themselves are often portrayed with dramatic flair. Boiling oil poured from above, flaming arrows streaking across the sky, and massive stones dropped on attackers dominate cinematic sieges. While some of these elements contain pieces of truth, they were far less theatrical than often shown. Boiling oil, for instance, was rarely used. It was expensive and dangerous to handle. More common were boiling water, heated sand or quicklime, all easier to produce in the quantities needed. Flaming arrows were more symbolic than effective. Most castle walls and roofs were stone or tile, not easily set ablaze. True siege warfare was slow, grinding, and filled with long periods of waiting, punctuated by bursts of sudden struggle. Another myth centres around the notion that castles were impregnable. Films often portray them as fortresses that could withstand any army, but history tells a different story. Castles could fall due to betrayal, starvation, or sheer persistence from attackers. Many were captured not by direct assault, but by cutting off supplies, poisoning water sources, or bribing gatekeepers. The drawbridge and portcullis were strong barriers, yet human decisions mattered more than steel or stone. Some of the most famous castles in Europe changed hands multiple times over the centuries, despite their formidable design. Popular stories also tend to exaggerate the presence of secret passages, hidden dungeons, and elaborate traps. While a handful of castles included escape tunnels or concealed chambers, these were rare and often far simpler than imagination suggests. Most so-called dungeons were just storage cellars or rooms later repurposed for captivity. Torture chambers, another cinematic favourite, were not standard features in 13th century castles. Punishments in this era were more likely to be carried out publicly as a demonstration of authority rather than behind hidden doors. Even the lifestyle of nobles is often misunderstood. Movies portray them constantly feasting, drinking from golden goblets, and living lives of effortless privilege. Reality was more restrained. Feasts occurred but not daily, and resources were not limitless. Meals were shaped by the seasons, availability of preserved foods, and the unpredictability of agriculture. Nobles oversaw their lands with seriousness. Their status came with expectations of governance, hospitality, and military readiness. They held courts, settled disputes, maintained alliances, and ensured the welfare of those who depended on their protection. Their daily routines involved far more responsibility than indulgence. One of the most persistent myths is the princess in the tower, a trope that suggests noble women lived isolated, sheltered lives, removed from the complexities of the castle. In reality, noble women often managed estates, oversaw finances, arranged marriages, negotiated with tenants, and served as diplomatic figures in their own right. Their education frequently included literacy, estate management, and familiarity with law. The notion of passive confinement overlooks their significant roles in the functioning of the household and the region. The location of castles is another area where imagination often strays from reality. While many films place them dramatically atop sheer cliffs or rising from lonely plains, most 13th century castles were built with deliberate strategic purpose. A river bend, a trade route, a borderland, or a fertile valley often determined where the walls would rise. Castles positioned on hills or ridges gained defensive advantage, but even these were carefully selected for access to resources, visibility, and communication. Their placement shaped local economies, influenced settlement patterns, and acted as anchors for emerging towns. Even moats carry myths. They are shown as deep, gleaming waterways filled with hazards, sometimes even creatures. Real moats varied dramatically. Some were wide trenches filled with water, while others were dry ditches designed to break the momentum of attackers. A water-filled moat could be shallow, muddy, and difficult to cross rather than dramatic. The true advantage of a moat was not its depth, but the obstacle it created, forcing attackers into vulnerable positions while defenders watched from above. As evening drew closer in a 13th century fortress, the castle's true nature became clearer. Not the romantic vision shaped by modern imagination, but a fusion of necessity and authority. These strongholds symbolized power, protection, obligation, and sometimes fear. They shaped medieval life as much through what they prevented as through what they sheltered. Behind every myth is a quieter truth. Castles were built to endure uncertainty. Their stones held stories of conflict and governance, faith and betrayal, wealth and hardship. They were less glamorous than legend suggests, yet far more complex than their cinematic shadows. By the afternoon, the 13th century castle settled into one of its quieter phases, a period when the earlier bustle faded into a softer hum of controlled movement. The stone walls, warmed slightly by the midday sun, held pockets of heat in their upper courses, while the lower edges remained cool to the touch. Servants passed through the great interior stairwells with practiced silence, their footfalls dull against the worn stone steps. These staircases twisted in tight spirals, built this way for defence, but over time the daily routines of castle life had made them familiar paths of predictable rhythm. Every turn opened into a new layer of the keep, and each level carried its own tone, from the guarded seriousness of the lower halls to the reserved quiet of the upper chambers. Not far from the solar, several servants worked in a space seldom seen by guests, the small room used for maintaining garments and household linens. Here the air was filled with the faint smell of lye soap and wool. Bundles of cloth hung from wooden pegs, and the narrow slit window cast a pale, cold stripe across the floor. A young woman knelt beside a basin, patiently rubbing a stain from a patterned cloak that belonged to the lord's household. The colours of the garment had faded slightly from long use, but the embroidery on the hem still held fine details that revealed weeks of painstaking work. Textiles in the 13th century were not merely practical, they were investments, symbols of status, and often heirlooms. Every thread mattered, and maintaining them was a craft in itself. Down the hallway, the steward's clerk worked at a small writing table tucked against the wall. The table was little more than a plank atop two trestles, but it served its purpose well enough. He sharpened a quill with a small knife, tapped the excess ink from its tip, and returned to the parchment he was copying. The script was careful, deliberate, shaped by years of practice. Few people in the castle could read or write, and those who could bore the responsibility of preserving everything from grain tallies to correspondence with nearby estates. The clerk's work unfolded in near silence, broken only by the soft scratch of ink across parchment. It was the kind of sound that vanished if you didn't pay attention to it. Gentle, steady, almost soothing. Beyond the clerk's chamber, one of the castle's private rooms was being prepared for the evening. This space belonged to a noblewoman, and though small compared to what later centuries would consider a private bedroom, it held a quiet dignity shaped by the objects within it. A carved wooden chest sat by the wall, its iron hardware darkened by time. A narrow bed frame, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, was being turned and aired by a servant. She lifted the mattress with steady strength, loosening the compacted straw and allowing air to freshen the fibres. Bedding was precious, and keeping it comfortable required regular attention. Near the bed, a small brazier glowed faintly, giving off a thin stream of warmth that seeped into the cool stone around it. The noblewoman's chamber also held a few items that revealed her world in subtle ways. A small polished mirror of metal, a comb carved from bone, a linen coif folded neatly on a stool, and a spindle with wool still wrapped around it. Even those with status in the 13th century took part in the labour of woolen cloth, if only symbolically. Spinning was considered a noble occupation, tied not to rank but to virtue. It was a reminder that life within the castle walls, no matter one's position, was deeply connected to the rhythms of material work. Further into the keep, the sounds of military preparation carried faintly through a narrow passage. A trio of guards were gathered in the armoury, a cramped room lined with wooden racks that held mail hauberks, kettle helmets, and long ashwood spears. The metallic scent of iron mixed with the smell of oiled leather. One guard tightened a strap on his gambeson, the padded undergarment worn beneath mail, while another sharpened a blade slowly along a whetstone. They spoke little, for this was not a moment of alarm, only routine maintenance. Weapons and armour required constant care, and the familiar scrape of metal echoed softly against the stone hall. The guards worked with quiet focus, knowing that even in peaceful times a castle was never truly at rest. Across the courtyard, accessed through a covered passageway, was the small chamber where the castle's herbalist kept her supplies. The air was thick with the fragrance of dried plants, rosemary, yarrow, mint and sage, each hung from the rafters in carefully arranged bundles. Small earthen jars lined the shelves, each marked with a simple symbol to identify its contents. The herbalist moved carefully along the shelves, inspecting the dried leaves and roots, sorting them into piles for evening preparations. Her work was both practical and hopeful, for in a world without sophisticated medicine, knowledge of herbs was a lifeline. The dim light of the chamber softened the outlines of the hanging bundles, creating a tapestry of muted green shadows that swayed gently whenever the door opened. As the afternoon deepened, the day's chores began transitioning into their evening patterns. A servant carrying a wicker basket filled with firewood passed through the arched corridor leading toward the great hall. Her steps were measured, the basket balanced carefully against her hip. The great hall, though still quiet, had already begun its transformation for the night ahead. Torches were being replaced with fresh ones, their oils checked and wicks trimmed. A pair of servants unfolded long wooden tables, easing them into place with practiced coordination. The benches followed, each one dragged across the floor with a low scrape. In the centre of the hall, a servant knelt to stoke the embers in the large hearth, coaxing them back to life. Sparks floated upward before fading into the shadows. By the time the sun dipped lower outside the walls, the castle's atmosphere shifted once more. The quieter afternoon rhythms gave way to a gentle anticipation that drifted through every level of the keep. The work of the morning and afternoon was invisible now, folded into the structure of the castle itself. The cleanly swept passages, the mended garments, the prepared hearths, the linens aired and folded, the weapons sharpened, the herbs sorted, the tables set. The people who moved through the castle at this hour did so with a sense of completion, carrying out their last rounds before evening settled fully. In this brief window between the labours of the day and the gathering of the night, the castle felt almost suspended, as though the heavy stones were holding their breath. Light from the narrow windows grew softer, fading into the cool tones of twilight. The air was still, and the sounds of the castle, footsteps, voices, tools, all seemed to soften into a calm, steady cadence that marked the close of another day in a place shaped by endurance, routine, and the quiet persistence of the people who lived within its walls. By late afternoon, the life of the 13th century castle shifted toward the quieter duties that prepared the fortress for nightfall. The outer courtyard, which had echoed with the bustle of traders, labourers, and livestock earlier in the day, now carried a different tone, slower, cooler, wrapped in the lengthening shadows cast by the curtain walls. A pair of stable hands moved methodically between the stalls, brushing the last of the dirt and straw from the horses' coats. The soft, steady strokes of the brushes blended with the low snort of a mare settling in for the evening. Lanterns hung on iron hooks outside each stall, giving off a faint glow that pushed gently against the deepening dusk. Not far from the stables, the castle's kitchen garden lay quiet beneath the dimming sky. Though smaller than the fields beyond the walls, this garden was essential, a patch of earth close enough to the kitchen to provide herbs, onions, and hardy greens for the lord's household. A single gardener bent over a row of winter herbs, checking the soil with practiced touch. His hands were rough and stained, shaped by years of coaxing life from thin medieval earth. Even in winter there was always something to tend, frost cloth to adjust, soil to loosen, remnants of the last harvest to gather. The distant clang of the castle smithy echoed faintly across the courtyard, a reminder that the castle's heartbeat never fully quieted. In a small workshop tucked beneath one of the inner towers, the castle's carpenter examined the progress of a repair he had begun earlier in the week. Wooden beams leaned against the wall beside him, each one hewn from local timber and shaped with simple yet reliable tools. The scent of fresh-cut wood lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of dust. On the workbench, the carpenter held a half-finished stool, turning it carefully in his hands as he inspected the joints. Furniture in the 13th century was not decorative but durable, built to withstand years of heavy use. Every notch, peg and panel mattered. The carpenter worked in near silence, pausing occasionally to step back and judge proportions by eye alone. Above this workshop, a narrow stair led to the chapel, one of the quietest and most solemn spaces in the keep. The light that entered here was thin and pale, slipping through a tall, narrow window of uneven glass. A few candles burned on the small stone altar, their flames wavering gently as air moved through the chamber. A monk associated with the castle, one entrusted with spiritual duties, swept the floor in slow, even strokes. His robes brushed softly against the stone as he worked, and each movement was steady, contemplative. In the stillness, faint echoes of chanting from earlier in the day seemed to linger, giving the room a sense of quiet continuity. For many in the castle, this space served as a rare refuge, a reminder of a world outside the demands of labour and hierarchy. On the ramparts, a pair of guards kept their afternoon watch. The wind was sharper here, carrying the scent of distant fields and cold stone. From this vantage point, they could see the narrow roads leading into the valley, the dense forest edging the far horizon, and the faint traces of smoke rising from nearby villages. The guards wore layers of wool beneath their cloaks, the fabric pressed smooth by constant use. One leaned against the crenellation, scanning the distance with a half-lidded focus, while the other adjusted the straps on his helmet. Their duties were simple but essential: vigilance, rotation, and readiness. The world beyond the castle walls was unpredictable, and the guards knew that peace could shift without warning. Back inside, the castle's small children, those born to servants or workers who lived within the fortress, gathered in a quiet alcove near the warmth of a side hearth. Their mothers kept a watchful eye as they sorted small piles of kindling, stacking the pieces by length and thickness. It was a task given not to occupy them, but to teach them. In a medieval castle, work and learning blended from an early age. The children chattered softly, their voices bouncing gently against the stone. Occasionally, one of the older servants would smile at the sound, remembering their own childhood spent in similar corners. Childhood in the 13th century was brief, but moments like this, pockets of warmth, and simple tasks, offered a rare sense of ease. Near the great hall, a servant prepared the torches for the evening. He dipped fresh wicks into a pot of warm tallow, letting the excess drip away before securing each wick into its wooden handle. The smell was strong, a mixture of smoke and animal fat, but familiar to anyone who lived within the keep. Torches were vital. Without them, the castle would fall into darkness each night. As he worked, the servant lined the finished torches along a bench, each one ready to be mounted in its iron bracket once dusk gave way to full night. In another part of the keep, the Lord Steward met briefly with two of the senior servants. They stood beside a wooden table spread with small tokens, each representing an upcoming task. The steward moved one token to the edge of the table, marking a repair needed in the south passage. Another token represented the portioning of grain for the next 3 days, a calculation that required careful attention given the season and the stores remaining. The servants listened attentively, committing each instruction to memory. There were no written schedules for most workers. Everything relied on communication, trust, and repetition. As the sky dimmed further, the castle's inner courtyard took on a distinctive calm. Chickens scratched at the last remaining bits of grain scattered near the coop, and a pair of servants carried buckets to the well, lowering them into the cold, shadowed water. The sound of the rope creaking around the wooden winch echoed faintly across the courtyard, followed by the soft splash as the bucket broke the surface. Drawing water was a constant need, and though many tasks in the castle rotated daily, the well never sat idle for long. Inside the keep, a servant lit the first of the evening torches. Warm orange light spread across the stone corridor, softening the harsh angles and pushing back the dark. Shadows fluttered and stretched along the walls as the flames steadied. The torches transformed the castle, giving it an entirely different life after sunset, a place of dim glows, muted echoes, and long shifting silhouettes. With each torch lit, the structure felt warmer, more enclosed, almost cocoon-like despite its towering walls. As night approached, the castle gradually withdrew into a quieter, more introspective version of itself. Work slowed, voices softened. The remaining chores fell into predictable patterns. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and tallow, drifting through stairwells and into chambers where people prepared for the hours ahead. The 13th century keep, built for endurance and shaped by routine, found its balance again. The steady, unhurried conclusion to another day held within stone that had seen countless days before it. Warm air drifted through one of the inner stairwells of the 13th century castle as afternoon moved toward evening. The stones here retained heat longer than the colder walls outside, forming a gentle pocket of comfort that servants passed through with relief. Their footsteps softened on the worn treads, mixing with the faint scents rising from the kitchens below. Smoke, warm wool, and the earthy smell of simmering food. At the base of the stairs, a steward's assistant sorted parchment in a small workroom. He loosened the twine around each roll, spreading the sheets across a narrow wooden table. Lists of grain, tallies of candles, records of repairs, all of it moved through his hands. The parchment crackled softly as he checked the ink for smudging, turning each sheet toward the fading light. A shallow bowl of sand sat beside him for blotting, and the quiet rhythm of the task filled the room like a slow, steady breath. Across the corridor, the buttery held a colder atmosphere. Rows of ale casks lined the walls, their wooden staves beaded with a faint sheen of moisture from the winter air. A servant tapped each barrel lightly with a mallet, listening for the tones that told him which would need replenishing before nightfall. He filled a clay jug from a half-empty cask, the liquid glugging quietly into the vessel. The buttery's chill wrapped around him, contrasting with the torchlight flickering faintly overhead. Nearby, a storage alcove held rows of cured meats hanging from darkened ceiling beams. The air was dense with the scent of salt and smoke. A cook's helper examined each piece, trimming hardened edges and wrapping portions in cloth. Preserving food for a 13th century household required constant vigilance, and she moved with a quiet precision that reflected both skill and necessity. Each careful cut helped stretch the winter stores a little further. Back in the main corridor, servants carried bundles of firewood toward the castle's upper chambers. The logs scraped softly against their sleeves as they passed through the narrow, drafty passage. Firewood was measured out carefully each night, and the warmth of a chamber depended on these early evening preparations. The repetitive motion of lifting, carrying, and stacking became part of the castle's daily cadence, joining the countless small tasks that kept the fortress alive. At the end of the passage, the inner solar glowed with early firelight. A small hearth crackled steadily, its warmth washing gently over the room. Cushions were placed along a wooden bench, and shutters were drawn partially closed to hold in the heat. A young page tended the fire, shifting embers with an iron poker and placing a new log at the centre. The flames climbed slowly, filling the room with the muted shimmer that softened the stone walls and made the space feel like a refuge against the winter air. A noblewoman's attendant entered carrying a folded wool blanket. She shook it out carefully before laying it across the bench, smoothing its edges with practiced motions. The blanket had been woven in the castle's own workshop, dyed in colours muted by age and repeated use. In this room, warmer, quieter, closer to comfort, the fabric seemed to glow faintly in the fire's reflection. Beyond the solar, a lofted gallery stretched along the inner wall, its stone softened by tapestries that hung in faded rows. The woven scenes, hunting parties, vines, simple patterns, insulated the cold stone beneath them. A servant dusted the hangings with a bundled cloth, releasing small clouds that drifted through the angled daylight from a high window. The dust sparkled briefly before settling, leaving the gallery smelling faintly of wool and old dye. Farther along the passage, the noblewoman's writing chamber held a more focused quiet. A scribe sat at a narrow desk, sharpening his quill with a small knife. The slit window beside him let in a thin band of light that illuminated the grain of the wooden surface. He tested the quill's nib on a scrap of parchment, the ink forming delicate strokes. In winter, ink thickened easily, and a small pot of warmed water sat near his elbow. The soft sound of a quill on parchment gave the room a contemplative stillness. Nearby, the herb chamber offered a different atmosphere entirely. Bundles of dried lavender, thyme, nettle, and fennel hung from the rafters, releasing faint scents into the warm air. An older woman sorted through the bundles, crumbling dried leaves between her fingers and judging their strength. She set aside the most potent herbs for teas and poultices, her mortar and pestle ready for grinding. In a 13th century castle, this quiet room often stood between illness and recovery, its stores shaped by memory and experience. As the assistant finished her work, she stepped into the enclosed walkway above the inner ward. The late afternoon light entered in narrow stripes through the row of slit windows, stretching long shadows across the floor. Below, the courtyard moved at a slower pace now. Stable hands brushing horses a final time, a guard securing a door, the faint creak of the leather harnesses being checked for the night watch. Their movements created a subdued pattern that rose gently toward the walkway. By the time the sun slipped lower, the castle settled into its early evening rhythm. Fires glowed behind shuttered windows, servants carried out their final tasks, and the stone walls took on the quiet that arrived each day at this hour. The castle did not grow silent, but its sounds deepened, wood crackling in hearths, soft steps along corridors, fabric rustling as blankets were placed and shutters drawn. The fortress moved gracefully into the next part of its day, held together by the steady, unbroken work of the people within its 13th century walls. As evening deepened, the 13th century castle shifted once again, entering the long, slow arc toward night. The last traces of daylight faded from the narrow slit windows, leaving only the faintest glow across the upper reaches of the keep. The world outdoors retreated into cold shadows, but inside, the illuminated corridors and clustered pockets of warmth created a small enclosed universe of their own. People moved more quietly now, conserving their energy for the final tasks of the day. The stone walls absorbed the dim torchlight, softening it into warm, wavering bands that shimmered across the floors like a gentle pulse. On the lower level, the castle's small brewery room carried a distinctive scent, a mixture of warm grain, fermenting ale, and damp timber. Here, a single brewer tended to a set of wooden barrels bound with iron hoops. A trough of warm water sat nearby, and steam wafted upward as he rinsed the last residue from a mixing paddle. Brewing in the 13th century was a daily rhythm, not a luxury. Ale was safer to drink than most water sources, and the entire castle relied on it. The brewer leaned over a barrel, listening closely to the soft bubbling within. The sound told him everything he needed to know, whether the yeast was alive, whether the mixture was balanced, whether tomorrow's batch would be ready. It was a quiet craft shaped by instinct more than instruction. Across the corridor, an older servant prepared a narrow chamber used for evening mending. The room was small, warmed by a single brazier glowing steadily near the wall. She lowered herself onto a wooden stool and lifted a tunic that had been worn thin at the elbows. With practiced hands, she threaded a needle and began stitching small, even loops into the fabric. Her fingers moved with patience, the thread pulling snug with each pass. Candlelight washed over the cloth, illuminating the subtle variations in the wool. Garments seldom went to waste in a 13th century keep. Each one told a story of work, weather, and survival. Her repairs kept those stories alive a little longer. Deeper in the keep, the armoury had grown quieter since the afternoon. Only one guard remained, standing beside a long table where several pieces of mail lay neatly folded in dense, heavy layers. He inspected the links carefully, running his fingers along the edges to check for breaks or worn rings. Maintaining mail was slow, meticulous work. A single damaged link could compromise the entire garment. He used a small iron tool to close a gap he found, pressing it slowly until the ring tightened into place. The gentle clink of metal under his breath was steady, almost hypnotic, echoing softly through the chamber before fading into the stone. In a chamber near the centre of the keep, she leaned over the pot, stirring steadily, the wooden ladle creating slow, circular ripples. The mixture inside, barley peas and shreds of leftover meat, thickened as the heat continued to work. Though simple, it was nourishing, meant to carry the household through the coldest hours until morning. Behind her, a row of clay bowls warmed near the fire. The room smelled of herbs, smoke, and the faint sweetness of onion. As she worked, she hummed softly, her voice blending with the gentle crackle of the embers. At the far end of the castle, the Lord Scribe worked under the dim light of an oil lamp. The flame flickered as he leaned over a parchment, copying lines of a charter sent from a distant estate. His quill scratched lightly against the surface, leaving streaks of dark ink that slowly dried to a soft matte finish. The scribe paused periodically to warm his fingers near the lamp. The chill crept into the stone chamber quickly once the sun had set. Behind him, bundles of parchments were tied neatly with twine, each containing correspondence, records, and inventories. His work was a quiet thread in the castle's larger tapestry, a connection between places, people, and memories that would otherwise vanish. Along another corridor, a midwife tended to a young servant who had fallen ill. The midwife carried a small satchel filled with dried herbs, bandages, and a few simple tools. She crushed a bit of dried mint and mixed it with warm water in a small wooden bowl, offering it to the girl in slow, encouraging gestures. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady, and the midwife placed a hand on her forehead, checking for heat. Illness in a medieval keep carried its own fears, but the midwife worked calmly, her experience forming a shield against uncertainty. A faint glow from a lantern bathed them both in soft light, creating a circle of warmth in the otherwise cool passage. Further up in the keep, the noblewoman's solar glowed faintly with the gentle light of several candles. She sat near a small chest covered with a linen cloth, sorting through a few treasured possessions, a piece of embroidery she had begun months ago, a carved comb, a small book of hours with worn edges. Though her position granted her privacy, the room itself was modest. Some carved wood, a narrow bed, a small table for writing. She paused to warm her hands above a brazier, watching the shadows dance across the walls. The evening offered her one of the few stretches of quiet she enjoyed each day, a lull between expectation and rest. Outside, the air cooled sharply as the last traces of daylight vanished behind the hills. A guard carrying a horn lantern made his rounds along the inner courtyard, checking the doors, shutters, and latches. The flame inside the lantern flickered in the breeze, casting long shapes across the ground. He paused to tighten a loose hinge on a gate, then continued along the perimeter, listening for anything unusual. Most nights were uneventful, but vigilance was the thread that kept the castle secure. Even moments of absolute stillness held a certain weight. Near the well, a pair of servants completed one final task, drawing the last bucket of water needed for the night. They worked together, guiding the rope slowly as they lifted the bucket from the cold depth. The moon, appearing through a break in the clouds, cast a pale reflection across the surface of the water inside the bucket. The servants carried it toward the kitchen entrance, their breath forming small clouds in the air. The courtyard felt more spacious at night, the absence of daily noise allowing the architecture itself to speak, the creak of wooden doors, the hum of wind along the battlements, the steady glow of torchlight from the walkways above. As the keep settled deeper into evening, a sense of stillness gradually replaced the work of the day. Doors closed softly, footsteps faded. The castle drew inward, embracing its own quiet interior rhythms. The stone absorbed the last warmth of the hearths, carrying it into the long hours of night. Inside, the people who lived and worked in the keep prepared for sleep. Warm air drifted through one of the inner stairwells of the 13th century castle as afternoon moved toward evening. The stones here retained heat longer than the colder walls outside, forming a gentle pocket of comfort that servants passed through with relief. Their footsteps softened on the worn treads, mixing with the faint scents rising from the kitchens below, smoke, warm wool, and the earthy smell of simmering food. At the base of the stairs, a steward's assistant sorted parchment in a small workroom. He loosened the twine around each roll, spreading the sheets across a narrow wooden table. Lists of grain, tallies of candles, records of repairs, all of it moved through his hands. The parchment crackled softly as he checked the ink for smudging, turning each sheet toward the fading light. A shallow bowl of sand sat beside him for blotting, and the quiet rhythm of the task filled the room like a slow, steady breath. Across the corridor, the buttery held a colder atmosphere. Rows of ale casks lined the walls, their wooden staves beaded with a faint sheen of moisture from the winter air. A servant tapped each barrel lightly with a mallet, listening for the tones that told him which would need replenishing before nightfall. He filled a clay jug from a half-empty cask, the liquid glugging quietly into the vessel. The buttery's chill wrapped around him, contrasting with the torchlight flickering faintly overhead. Nearby, a storage alcove held rows of cured meats hanging from darkened ceiling beams. The air was dense with the scent of salt and smoke. A cook's helper examined each piece, trimming hardened edges and wrapping portions in cloth. Preserving food for a 13th century household required constant vigilance, and she moved with a quiet precision that reflected both skill and necessity. Each careful cut helped stretch the winter stores a little further. Back in the main corridor, servants carried bundles of firewood toward the castle's upper chambers. The logs scraped softly against their sleeves as they passed through the narrow drafty passage. Firewood was measured out carefully each night, and the warmth of a chamber depended on these early evening preparations. The repetitive motion of lifting, carrying, and stacking became part of the castle's daily cadence, joining the countless small tasks that kept the fortress alive. At the end of the passage, the inner solar glowed with early firelight. A small hearth crackled steadily, its warmth washing gently over the room. Cushions were placed along a wooden bench, and shutters were drawn partially closed to hold in the heat. A young page tended the fire, shifting embers with an iron poker and placing a new log at the centre. The flames climbed slowly, filling the room with the muted shimmer that softened the stone walls and made the space feel like a refuge against the winter air. A noblewoman's attendant entered carrying a folded wool blanket. She shook it out carefully before laying it across the bench, smoothing its edges with practiced motions. The blanket had been woven in the castle's own workshop, dyed in colours muted by age and repeated use. In this room, warmer, quieter, closer to comfort, the fabric seemed to glow faintly in the fire's reflection. Beyond the solar, a lofted gallery stretched along the inner wall, its stone softened by tapestries that hung in faded rows. The woven scenes, hunting parties, vines, simple patterns, insulated the cold stone beneath them. A servant dusted the hangings with a bundled cloth, releasing small clouds that drifted through the angled daylight from a high window. The dust sparkled briefly before settling, leaving the gallery smelling faintly of wool and old dye. Farther along the passage, the noblewoman's writing chamber held a more focused quiet. A scribe sat at a narrow desk, sharpening his quill with a small knife. The slit window beside him let in a thin band of light that illuminated the grain of the wooden surface. He tested the quill's nib on a scrap of parchment, the ink forming delicate strokes. In winter, ink thickened easily, and a small pot of warmed water sat near his elbow. The soft sound of quill on parchment gave the room a contemplative stillness. Nearby, the herb chamber offered a different atmosphere entirely. Bundles of dried lavender, thyme, nettle, and fennel hung from the rafters, releasing faint scents into the warm air. An older woman sorted through the bundles, crumbling dried leaves between her fingers and judging their strength. She set aside the most potent herbs for teas and poultices, her mortar and pestle ready for grinding. In a 13th century castle, this quiet room often stood between illness and recovery, its stores shaped by memory and experience. As the assistant finished her work, she stepped into the enclosed walkway above the inner ward. The late afternoon light entered in narrow stripes through the row of slit windows, stretching long shadows across the floor. Below, the courtyard moved at a slower pace now, stable hands brushing horses a final time, a guard securing a door, the faint creak of leather harnesses being checked for the night watch. Their movements created a subdued pattern that rose gently toward the walkway. By the time the sun slipped lower, the castle settled into its early evening rhythm. Fires glowed behind shuttered windows, servants carried out their final tasks, and the stone walls took on the quiet that arrived each day at this hour. The castle did not grow silent, but its sounds deepened, wood crackling in hearths, soft steps along corridors, fabric rustling as blankets were placed and shutters drawn. The fortress moved gracefully into the next part of its day, held together by the steady, unbroken work of the people within its 13th century walls, each ready to rise again at dawn to rebuild the cycle, one shaped by duty, endurance, and the steady persistence of life within Ancients. The rhythm of the 13th century settled into its usual pace as the medieval castle shifted from early chores into the quieter stretch of the late morning. The last traces of sweeping still hung in the cold air, and dust stirred lazily through beams of winter light filtering in from narrow windows. The castle always carried this slow drift between tasks, as if the stone itself controlled the tempo of the people moving inside it. Deeper in the interior, the air warmed noticeably. Here in the 13th century service corridors of the castle, the chill faded into something gentler, pulled upward by heat radiating from the kitchen hearths. Servants crossing these invisible temperature borders felt the change instantly, moving from numb fingertips to flushed cheeks in just a few steps. It was part of the daily landscape, an unspoken map they navigated without pause. Inside the 13th century castle kitchen, the day's most important transformations were already underway. The fire glowed low and hot, giving the room a steady amber warmth that wrapped itself around the simmering clay pots. the scent of onions softening merged with barley swelling in broth, an ordinary aroma that defined medieval life far more than any grand feast. Here, in this smoky chamber, the castle's heart beat steadily. A kitchen girl turned the spit by hand, her movements slow and practiced, the wooden handle warm against her palm. The meat was small, a rabbit or a bird, but that didn't make the work any less important. Nothing in a 13th century kitchen was wasted. Underfoot, the rushes released a faint grassy scent when stepped on. Fresh rushes laid just days earlier stayed green at the tips and carried the brightness of sweet flag woven among them. In a medieval castle, these rushes softened the smells of smoke and damp wool that clung to every stone. The servants didn't comment on it. They simply lived inside the scent of the season, knowing today smelled better than it would when the rushes grew old and had to be swept out. The cook, a steady figure with grey threading through her hair, guided the room without needing to raise her voice. She'd spent decades inside this 13th century kitchen, long enough to know the heat of the fire by feel alone, long enough that the other servants read her expressions as clearly as instructions. A nod sent someone to fetch more barley from the storeroom. A slight lift of her chin told another to shift the pot closer to the hottest coals. The entire kitchen lived inside her rhythm. Back in the 13th century castle corridors, the light shifted as the morning climbed. Narrow arched windows fitted with uneven lattice glass bent the sunlight into scattered patches on the floor. Servants moved through these patches quietly, carrying wooden stave buckets bound with iron hoops. The water inside sloshed just enough to echo off the stone, creating a soft rhythmic sound that blended with the footsteps of the people who passed through these halls countless times a day. The steward made his rounds with precise steps. His responsibilities reached into every corner of the 13th century castle. Storerooms, grain tallies, firewood counts, the condition of damp stone near winter walls. He paused often, running a practiced hand along the mortar, feeling for any sign of seepage that would matter come spring. In a medieval fortress, maintenance was a quiet, endless war fought against cold, water and time, and he understood that better than anyone. Not far from him, a young servant knelt beside a wooden bench, scrubbing it with warm water mixed with sand. Sand was a common cleanser in medieval households, its rough granules cutting through grease without damaging the wood. She paused occasionally to wring out her cloth. Her fingers reddened from the lingering chill of the water. Behind her, a thin draught streamed in from a tall arrow loop carved into the castle wall. Built for defence rather than comfort, the opening pulled threads of cold air into the corridor, creating a narrow pocket of winter she couldn't avoid. Up above in the great hall of the 13th century castle, the day's preparations unfolded slowly. The trestle tables were still empty, but the space hummed with early motion. A servant swept the floor with a bundled twig broom, her strokes long and even, gathering stray rushes and yesterday's crumbs into neat piles. Her broom made a soft whispering scrape against the worn stone. The hall amplified even quiet sounds, carrying them across the high beams and back down again in gentle echoes. At the far end, near the raised dais where the lord and lady would sit in the evening, two boys polished brass candlesticks. Evening was the only time the great hall blazed with true brightness. During the day, candles were precious. The boys worked slowly, using an oiled cloth to coax the metal back to a warm gleam. Their movements were synchronized in a way that only repetitive labor could produce. Down in a smaller chamber of the 13th century keep, another servant beat dust from a straw-stuffed mattress. She lifted the heavy sack of fabric and struck it rhythmically with a wooden paddle, each blow sending pale clouds of dust into the air. The light from a narrow window caught the dust as it spiraled upward before drifting back down. Straw mattresses were simple necessities, but they needed regular tending or they grew unpleasant quickly. Her work, though tiring, was part of the quiet maintenance that made the castle livable for those who slept inside it. Stepping into the courtyard, the sounds of the 13th century castle shifted into a harsher register. Snow crunched under boots. A blacksmith's hammer rang sharply from his forge, each strike sending sparks upward in brief flashes. Stable hands brushed down horses, their hands moving in long strokes over winter-thick coats. Woodcutters split logs for the evening hearths, the axes rising and falling in steady rhythm. Even here, where the sky opened above the walls, the castle moved to a deliberate pulse that continued regardless of weather. A messenger arrived at midday, his cloak dusted with snow and his breath hanging in the cold air. The porter recognized the colours he wore and ushered him through the gate without hesitation. Messages were lifelines in the 13th century. The only way distant lands, allies and estates remained connected. The messenger's arrival could shift the tone of the entire afternoon depending on what he carried. By the time he reached the steward, the castle had returned to its quiet routine. The kitchen fires had been tended again. Rushes had shifted under countless feet. The great hall had been swept, and the servants continued their unspoken patterns. Everything in a 13th century castle functioned through these overlapping routines, small acts, repeated endlessly, forming the heartbeat of a place built from cold stone and constant labour. A faint haze hung in the deeper hallways of the 13th century castle, carrying the smell of warm iron and cooling ash from the hearths below. The air here held a different quality than the service floors, closer, denser, shaped by the workrooms that lined these passages. Every few steps brought a shift in temperature or scent, as if each chamber breathed its own atmosphere into the corridor. A servant walking through could tell which rooms were occupied long before she reached their doors, guided by the soft clues the castle released into its own interior. The first chamber along this level was the small sewing room, where light from a narrow window stretched across a table crowded with folded linens. A seamstress sat close to the window, taking advantage of the pale daylight while she still could. Her hands moved steadily through a tear in a wool tunic, the needle rising and falling with a calm familiarity. Each stitch drew the fabric together, quiet as a whisper, the faint scratch of thread passing through wool mixed with the muted sounds of the courtyard far below, distant hooves shifting, stable hands calling to one another, the thud of an axe splitting firewood. Winter always pushed the castle's work inward, and even from this room the outside world felt a degree removed. A brazier glowed near the seamstress's feet, radiating a gentle warmth that softened the chill creeping in from the stone walls. Above her, on wooden pegs hammered into the plaster, hung garments waiting for a repair, tunics worn thin at the elbows, hoods frayed from long use, and a child-sized cloak missing its clasp. Mending them was slow work, but it kept clothing circulating through the household when every fibre mattered. Wool didn't come cheaply, and in a 13th century fortress, nothing that could be salvaged was ever thrown aside. Farther down the corridor, the stonemason's room held a markedly different mood. Here, shadows pooled near the edges of the chamber, broken only by the thin daylight spilling through a slit window. Dust settled on the floor in soft grey patches, stirred only when the mason lifted a chisel or shifted a block of stone. He worked with the quiet concentration of someone who understood the permanence of his craft. Each tap of his hammer shaped the surface of a replacement stone that would soon fill a crack along the northern wall. Repairs like this kept winter from pushing deeper into the keep. His blows were precise, rhythmic enough to create a kind of muted music that reverberated faintly through the adjoining passage. Stepping past the mason's room, the corridor widened slightly and curved toward the inner yard. A pair of guards moved along this stretch, their boots leaving soft echoes behind them. The sound of their footsteps differed subtly from the lighter tread of the servants, firmer, heavier, shaped by the weight of mail and leather belts hung with gear. Their path took them toward the training yard, where the cold air carved sharp edges around every sound. There, a few men practiced with wooden swords, their strikes meeting with hollow thuds. Breath misted in front of them with each exertion. The yard rang with discipline rather than noise, measured movements, controlled exertion, and the occasional call of correction from a senior guard. Just above the training yard, a narrow staircase led to a storage loft where sacks of grain, folded blankets, and tools rested in neat rows. Two servants climbed these steps together, balancing their loads carefully as the stone spiraled upward. In the loft, the air was warmer than the corridors, but filled with the dry scent of stored barley and oats. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each marked with charcoal symbols to track the castle's dwindling winter supplies. One servant noted the contents on a small wax tablet, pressing the stylus firmly enough to leave clear grooves. Inventory was as much a winter ritual as chopping wood or tending fires, and every change had to be recorded before the steward made his rounds. Across the castle, the small chapel maintained a different rhythm altogether. The servant assigned to this space arranged candles near the altar, trimming their wicks and setting aside the curled scraps of wax for later use. The narrow stained glass window, simple, geometric, nothing like the elaborate panels of later centuries, cast muted colour across the stone floor. She swept the steps with a twig broom, moving slowly so as not to disturb the quiet that seemed native to the room. Her sweeping made only a soft brush of sound, blending naturally with the hush that permeated the space. Leaving the chapel, the corridor led toward a series of small chambers where artisans worked through the cold months. In one, a weaver sat at a simple upright loom, guiding wool threads through the warp with steady, patient movements. The loom's wooden frame creaked gently as she shifted her weight, and each shuttle pass added a new line of texture to the cloth growing beneath her hands. The pattern was not decorative, functional, sturdy, meant for cloaks or bedding that would serve the household through the remainder of winter. The soft thump of the loom marked time in a way nothing else in the castle did. In the next room, the Fletcher inspected a bundle of arrow shafts. His chamber smelled faintly of cured wood and goose feathers. A small brazier glowed beside him, warming the glue he used to fix fletchings in place. His tools, knives, clamps, bits of twine, were arranged neatly on a wooden board. Arrows were always in need. Hunting, training, and defence drained the supply steadily. Each shaft he checked was judged by touch and sight. The straightness of the wood, the evenness of its grain, the balance from one end to the other. He leaned close to the faint daylight as he worked, turning each piece slowly in his hands. Near midday, the busiest part of this upper floor became the laundry chamber. Two women worked beside large wooden tubs, one stirring clothes in warm, soapy water, while the other wrung them out. The scent of heated lye soap hung in the air, mixing with the steamy warmth rising from the tubs. Damp linens were draped over ropes strung near the window, the daylight illuminating their pale folds. Each cloth dripped steadily into a trough below, the water running off into a channel cut into the stone floor. Laundry was among the most physically demanding tasks in the castle, and it filled the chamber with motion, lifting, wringing, carrying. Yet the pace remained quiet, measured, and practiced. From the laundry chamber, the sound of a bell faintly reached the corridor. It was not a call to gather, but simply a signal marking the next turn of the day. The servants moved without hurry toward their next duties, accustomed to the way the castle's hours folded around one another without disruption. The shifting light in the windows told as much about the time as the bell ever did. By early afternoon, the innermost rooms of the keep held a mellow warmth. Braziers glowed softly, and the sunlight slanted through the windows at a lower angle. Shadows lengthened across thresholds and walls, stretching into the corners where daylight rarely reached. The castle didn't fall silent, far from it, but the sounds grew gentler, cloth brushing stone, grain settling in sacks, tools being set down carefully on wooden tables, the quiet continuity of tasks that shaped each day in ways small but essential. Across the entire 13th century fortress, the work never stopped, but nothing felt hurried. Everything moved with intention, guided by the routines that kept the walls strong, the fires lit, and the people within safe through the long winter. The stones of a 13th century castle carry a kind of memory, a quiet endurance shaped by the people who walked its halls and the centuries that followed after they were gone. Long after the last torch was extinguished and the final watchman stepped down from the battlements, the walls remained, holding fragments of the world they once protected. A castle was never just a fortress. It was a centre of power, a refuge, an administrative hub, and a place where countless small routines unfolded day after day until they formed the rhythm of a life now distant yet still faintly familiar. If you were to walk through one of these great structures today, across the uneven stone floors, past narrow windows shaped by the hands of long-forgotten masons, you would feel both the presence and the absence of the people who lived here. The sound of their footsteps no longer echoes in the corridors, but their world lingers in the architecture itself. The thickness of the walls hints at the fear of siege that once loomed over medieval life. The narrow staircases, spiralling tightly upward, reveal the strategic thinking of builders who designed them to favour defenders. Even the placement of the Great Hall and Solar speaks to a society ordered by hierarchy, duty, and the need for warmth in a cold landscape. Outside the castle walls, the land that once defined its purpose has often changed beyond recognition. Rivers that supplied water and trade may have shifted their course. Farmlands once worked by tenant families might now be fields of grass or modern towns. Roads that carried messengers and merchants, winding under the gatehouse and across the drawbridge, may have disappeared entirely, replaced by routes that suit a different age. Yet the castle remains, anchored to the geography that once gave it strength. Geography mattered deeply in the Middle Ages. A good vantage point could determine a lord's fortune, just as a vulnerable position could cost him everything. What these surviving fortresses rarely show at first glance is the constant work they once required. Their walls did not stand by strength alone. They endured because of the people who mended cracks after harsh winters, who reinforced gates before times of uncertainty, who carried firewood to the upper chambers to keep the household warm. Generations of servants, craftsmen, guards and stewards shaped the castle as much as the nobles whose names fill the records. Their labour left no monumental inscriptions, Yet every repaired stone, polished helm and stitched garment was part of the structure's survival. A castle was a community as much as a stronghold. The noble families who ruled within these walls experienced the castle differently. For them, it was a seat of authority and responsibility. Their days were filled with decisions about land, disputes, alliances, and the welfare of the people under their care. Behind the armour and titles were individuals navigating a world where stability could shift with the turn of a season or the message carried by a single rider. Their great halls hosted celebrations and negotiations, their chapels marked marriages and farewells, and their courts settled matters that shaped the lives of entire regions. The castle gave them power, but it also demanded vigilance. History remembers some of these castles for famous battles or dramatic sieges. Others are known for the documents signed within their walls, which altered political landscapes far beyond their gates. Many more simply existed in the background of medieval life, quietly, consistently fulfilling their purpose without great fanfare. These lesser-known sites are no less important, for they reflect the everyday reality of the Middle Ages far better than the handful of fortresses that appear in legends. Not every castle hosted a king, not every lord commanded armies, but each had a role in maintaining the delicate balance of authority and order that defined the feudal world. Over time, the purpose of castles changed. The arrival of gunpowder in Europe began a slow transformation that rendered their walls less effective. Artillery reshaped the art of defence, forcing builders to reconsider designs that had served for centuries. New fortifications emerged, lower, thicker, angled against incoming fire, while older castles evolved into administrative gatehouses, manor houses, or symbols of lineage rather than instruments of war. The moat that once deterred invaders became a quiet pond. The arrow slits that once housed vigilant archers grew still. The drawbridge remained as a relic rather than a necessity. Yet even as warfare advanced, people remained drawn to these ancient strongholds. Their silhouettes against the horizon carried stories of endurance and identity. Communities grew around them, centuries after their military purpose ended. Some became ruins consumed by vines, their stones softening into the landscape. Others were restored, preserved, or repurposed, offered a second life by those who valued their quiet authority. Whether crumbling or intact, these castles continued to shape the land around them long after their builders had vanished. And despite the distortions of myths and movies, the true nature of these places persists when one looks closely. The real medieval castle was neither the dark, terrifying labyrinth of fiction, nor the gilded palace of romance. It was something more grounded, a practical response to a world marked by uncertainty. Its rooms were designed for warmth, work, and watchfulness. Its builders laboured with limited tools and knowledge, yet created structures that could outlast kingdoms. Its occupants balanced hospitality with caution, prosperity with responsibility, tradition with adaptation. What remains today is not merely architecture. It is the imprint of lives lived within stone walls, ordinary and extraordinary intertwined. The echoes of conversations in the great hall, the regular tolling of a chapel bell, the shuffle of straw underfoot, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the soft steps of a messenger arriving after a long ride. These sounds are gone, but their memory lingers in the spaces where they once unfolded. As evening settles over a surviving 13th century castle, the quiet carries a different meaning now. No guards take to the battlements, no servants prepare for guests, yet the weight of the past is still present in the air, held in every archway and vaulted ceiling. The castle stands as a testament not to glamour or fantasy, but to resilience, to stone shaped with purpose, to people living in a world both fragile and formidable, and to the long continuum of history that extends from their time to ours.